Hey folks, it's Patriot Nurse. In this video today, we are going to discuss the next civil war in the United States and the top 5 diseases that could be circulating during that time. How do we prepare for them? What are the alternatives to using pharmaceuticals if we don't have access to them? What were the ways that people of old treated these diseases? We're going to delve into it today. Let's get started. So the top 5 diseases that I want to go over with you are those that are frequently recorded in records regarding the war between the states, also known as the Civil War. And it's important to actually look at these historical documents when we evaluate preparedness for the future. The diseases that circulated during that time included cholera, definitely dysentery and general diarrhea, typhoid as another one, and also measles and tuberculosis. So we're going to go over those today. We're going to go over how they were treated back then, how they're currently treated with pharmaceuticals, and what our options are if we don't have pharmaceuticals, but we've got the plants around us. So cholera. Cholera, of course, is caused by a bacteria that essentially go into a heightened state of infectiousness whenever they acquire a host. So it spreads like wildfire, and for this reason, it was particularly feared not only during the times of the last Civil War, the war between the states, but also during the Oregon Trail. In fact, if you grew up as a child of the 80s or 90s playing Oregon Trail, you know that you have died of cholera was a big thing, closely followed by you have died of dysentery, but we're going to talk about that one next. Cholera, of course, presents with a rapid fluid loss of diarrhea and also vomiting, but the stool actually that you see with patients who are dealing with cholera, it looks like rice water. That's actually a key differential. We talk about this in class, actually, the classes that I teach, not only online, but also in person. A differential is effectively a hallmark. It's what sets one disease apart from the other. So that's how you would know for sure that you're dealing with cholera when you see the rapid onset, the rapid loss of fluids, and particularly the type of stool known as the rice water stool. Now, back in the day, cholera was treated with various different methods. The white coats of the day, the doctors with all the fancy letters after their name, in many cases, they resorted to poisoning people with heavy metals, things like mercury and lead. This is what they used to deal with diseases back then. They also did things like bloodletting. Not the smartest thing when we look at it, but it was the best medicine of the day, which I'm sure lots of people trusted. When you look at the ways that people on homesteads and also your doctor moms dealt with these diseases, most of the times they dealt with what they had around them, which was usually, if they were lucky, spices in their kitchen cabinet and maybe the plants that were growing in their garden. Now, one of the things that's not commonly known is that particularly in the South, there was a heavy degree of raiding that took place and of complete looting and war crimes against Southern civilians by the invading federal troops. And so setting the barns on fire, setting houses afire, looting foodstuffs, and also burning crops, including the herbs that were in the garden, this was just commonplace. So one of the reasons why these diseases spread so rampantly is because the ability to deal with them on the local level had basically been cut out from under many of these people. Supply lines were cut. And of course, the ability to consult, for instance, their reference books, that was all gone if your house was burnt down. So when we look at, for instance, preparing towards times to come, we really have to assume that the only knowledge that you've got is what you can access up in your head. The grid could be down, you might be away from home, not have your reference books, and basically only be able to operate with the knowledge and resources that you have stored up in between your 2 ears. And the herbs in particular that were utilized for cholera were actually things that were quite common. Sunflower leaves, peach leaves, and also bark from peach trees as well. Red raspberry leaf was another one due to its astringent properties, and also the bark of slippery elm. This was used in the days of old and also is utilized even today by people who don't wish to seek standard pharmaceutical treatment, which nowadays usually consists of an antibiotic like Cipro. And of course, in the case of cholera, antibiotics are your standard white coat treatment for this disease nowadays. But there's a few things that are potentially problematic about this. Number one is the availability of these drugs. And number two is how well they're tolerated and or the risk for side effects. And there are significant risks for catastrophic side effects when it comes to antibiotics. So when it comes right down to it, I would far rather advocate that people have a working knowledge of the plants around them, because your risk for catastrophic side effects from herbs are significantly less when utilized appropriately than, for instance, a lot of pharmaceuticals that people are holding on to that may or may not be utilized effectively, safely, and appropriately. The next of the diseases is dysentery, and in general, diarrhea. Now, one of the reasons why this is such a key thing to focus on now is because the same potential risk factors of contaminated water would be present in a prolonged grid down and also a Civil War 2.0 in the United States. Those factors are present now, potentially, as they certainly were in the past. And so one of the reasons why dysentery spread so rampantly, particularly throughout the South, is because as troop movements were moving throughout the area, of course, and encamping in different places, their feces and their waste products were making contact with common water supplies and also, of course, with common foodstuffs. So there are two main types of dysentery. You have amoebic dysentery, and then you have the dysentery that's caused by Shigella. Now, amoebic dysentery is really fascinating because the way that it manifests is different than Shigella. The key differential for amoebic dysentery is a large quantity of bloody and mucousy stools. Now, it's interesting because I actually have had amoebic dysentery. It was the souvenir I didn't want to bring back from Mexico. And no, I didn't go to Cancun to party. I went for a business conference, and I brought back so much in the way of information and also in the way of amoebas. So when you look at what happens to someone who deals with amoebic dysentery, that stool is going to be mucousy, it's going to have blood in it, and the blood basically looks like a squished cranberry, if you want to think about it that way. And it can actually end up, in severe cases, looking like quite a lot of blood, almost like somebody squirted ketchup in it. I know that's so gross, but it is what it is. And so one of the things that was done back in the day by the white coat world is, again, let's give people toxic heavy metals. And yeah, I wonder why they end up being cured of the ickies. It's because with the same heavy metals that killed the ickies, i.e. killed the amoebas or the bacteria, like Shigella, it also ended up killing healthy tissue, so you could inadvertently kill the patient. And it was actually quite common that people were dying from the interventions of the medical system at the time, as opposed to the disease itself. So when you look at diarrhea in general, and specifically with dysentery, the goal for supporting the body and the way that many herbal practitioners in the past dealt with it, and how we could look to a future where we wouldn't have conventional pharmaceuticals and try and deal with things the best we could in a prolonged grid down or a major breakdown of rule of law. When we look at the herbs that are available, again, it is quite similar actually to cholera, traditional cholera treatments from herbalists and vitalists. You're looking at supporting and nourishing the tissues and decreasing the inflammation of those mucous membranes with herbs, for instance, like chamomile and like catnip, and like, for instance, the slippery elm bark that we talked about. If all this seems like a lot of information, but you don't feel like you have your head wrapped around it, I've actually made a course to help you do just that. I have a 7-hour course available that talks about the herbal preparedness methods that were used by our ancestors in the past and how we can utilize them to be more providentially prepared for the future. So if you're interested in this video and you're really enjoying it so far, you'd probably like to take that class online, and I got links in the description box below. Let's talk about the third of these illnesses, and that's typhoid. Now, typhoid is a really fascinating disease. Of course, it's spread by a bacteria, but this bacteria, being a fecal-oral spread, prominently bacteria, this bacteria is transmitted through usually contaminated water. Now, if this sounds familiar at this point, the fecal-oral route, which everything hitherto this point we've talked about is spread by, whether it's cholera, whether it's dysentery, or now typhoid, all of this is presupposing effectively that you haven't had any way to sanitize your water, and that's really how you got sick. So if you're looking at a way to prepare against this, having a reliable way to filter your water is so essential, and a gravity filtration system that does not require electricity, that's key. And I've got links in the description box below. Also, head over to thepatriotnurse.com for more resources and information there. But you really do need a reliable way to filter your water against this. Typhoid in and of itself can show up effectively in 3 different stages. And it's actually hypothesized that Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, passed from typhoid fever because of the fact that the particular year that he died, the Thames River, which for those of you who live in Britain, you know, like the Thames at that time was flooding, and it was a significant problem. But people used to dump their sewage into the Thames River, and then when it would flood, of course, that sewage would come up on the banks. And so it's hypothesized, of course, that the palace, which was close in proximity to the flooded Thames River, there were flies that went back and forth that landed on the sewage from the flooded area by the riverbank and then flew up and landed on the food that was being eaten by Prince Albert. An actually really interesting and fascinating bit of historical recon when it comes to disease. So the typhoid itself manifests in 3 different stages along 3 different weeks, but it's really nasty in each case, and one of the key differentials actually is poop that looks like pea soup. So you have the toilet bowl full of pea soup, not necessarily what you'd expect. And so nowadays, of course, there are antibiotics that are used to treat this. But if we didn't have antibiotics for whatever reason, there's a major breakdown in rule of law or a supply issue, how would we use the herbs around us in order to support the body? And how did the herbalists of old utilize these herbs to treat things before there were pharmaceuticals? Well, again, there were several herbs that were primarily focused on supporting and nourishing the mucous membranes. Slippery elm, of course, is one of them. But also, due to the manifestation of typhoid, particularly in the second week, in about a third of people, there is a rash that comes up over the trunk of the body. Now, it's interesting because there is a school of thought amongst many herbalists, particularly of Ayurvedic practitioners, that holds whenever the body is manifesting a fever with a rash, that it is indicative of an inherent liver compromise. And so, according to this school of traditional thought, a supportive herb targeted towards the liver, such as, for instance, blessed thistle, would be utilized in order to support the detoxification of the body and allow the body to return itself to good working health. So, of course, blessed thistle would be one of these herbs. Red clover would be another one. And, of course, the herbs to soothe the intestinal tract, such as slippery elm, such as chamomile, such as catnip. Now we got the last two here. We've got the respiratory, the measles, and the tuberculosis. So measles, of course, many people are vaccinated against this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are covered, because the herd immunity only works if the gate to the herd is locked. And we have open and porous borders here in the Estados Unidos, and lots of people are coming over here bringing one of the many different variants of measles virus with them. So measles, of course, was something that was quite commonplace and actually is featured even in several older videos as a rite of passage effectively in childhood, and not something to be universally feared and pearl clutched over. Measles, of course, is the manifestation of a few different things. Usually it starts out with a rash behind the ears. You also have the cough, the runny nose, and the inflamed eyes. And there is a risk in particularly undernourished and malnourished populations of catastrophic side effects. Usually about 1 to 3 in 1,000 people who are dealing with measles will end up having something significant, such as encephalitis, potentially bordering on death. So there is a chance, but it's roughly about 1 to 3 in 1,000. Now, overall, the way that people used to deal with this back in the day was with everything from, again, the classic, here, it's heavy metal season. Let's just, and we're not talking AC/DC, let's just plaster them with, I don't know, lead and mercury, and maybe throw some opiates in there like laudanum, and just hope that everything works out. That was the white coat way back in the day. These spices that are familiar to many of us today, whether it's garlic as an antiviral, or ginger, or elderberry, and using honey to prepare syrups out of these are examples of how the doctor moms back in the day and the herbalists utilized what they had in order to take care of their people. And should we find ourselves in a similar circumstance in a prolonged grid down, or God forbid in Civil War 2.0 here in the United States, these are things that we would need to have stored up. Now, there are many places that you can find quality stores of, for instance, these different herbs in bulk online. We actually have on the Patriot Nurse website a starter stash of 20 different herbs to help start you out in your journey of preparedness if you wish to have several different herbs available to you. And also, as part of the 20 herb stash, we have an option where you can add on to it the School of Natural Healing, which is an excellent textbook, and it's the textbook that I use going for my master herbalist. It's a textbook to allow you a reference guide to walking through the utilization and the preparation of these different herbs. So, when you look at the garlic as an antiviral for measles, and when you look at the elderberry as also an antiviral, you're looking at using what's effectively around us should there not be conventional treatment available. So the last of the diseases that I've selected here is tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis was rampant during the war between the states for many different reasons. Now, a key thing to remember here, there are two main risk factors for an individual's likelihood to contract tuberculosis upon being exposed, and they are low body weight and vitamin D deficiency. That's right, low body weight and vitamin D deficiency. So can you see how, particularly in the South, where people's foodstuffs have been burned or destroyed, and where they were malnourished to begin with, certainly by the third year in, can you see how an individual would be much more likely to contract really any disease based upon those inherent deficiencies of nutrients? So this is one of the reasons why in my 4-day class that I teach, we talk about the nutrition aspect on the 3rd day, nutrition, herbs, and old school disease. Nutrition really is a backbone, not only for general preparedness, but also for prevention, appropriate prevention of different diseases. And yes, the capital P is there because nutrient deficiencies, particularly in the case of tuberculosis, are directly tied to contracting these diseases. Now, when you look at vitamin D, for instance, we know about the sun, of course, but did you know that cod liver oil, which is a traditional food, is a wonderful source of vitamin D? And so for that reason, many traditional foods, for instance, cod liver oil, were utilized not only to help support, but before we had treatments, for instance, like amphotericin, really, really toxic drugs to ultimately kill off the TB and keep people in remission. When you look at a world where these drugs are not available, you kind of have to default to what the ancient peoples used before. Cod liver oil, with its high levels of vitamin D, was one of the traditional foods that was used to prevent and in some cases treat by herbal practitioners these diseases of old, in particular tuberculosis, before we had modern pharmaceuticals. So when you look at in particular the respiratory diseases like tuberculosis, that cough and the ability really of the body to cleanse itself from the mucus that's dragging it down, that's really the area that's in need of targeted support. And prior to the advent of things like, for instance, the conventional antibiotics, the herbal practitioners of old, in particular the first peoples, the native peoples here in the United States, they knew these things, right? And so wild cherry bark was considered one of the main gold standards of treatment for respiratory diseases historically. And it's actually in the 20 herb kit that we carry on the website, thepatriotnurse.com. The wild cherry bark, in particular, prepared in the decocted form, is an excellent supportive and nourishing tonic for targeting the mucous membranes, in particular of the lungs, but really to nourish them and allow them to come back to their baseline. Marshmallow root is another one, and also mullein, a wonderful herb. And these were the herbs that were used by traditional practitioners back in the day, and also in the future, if we find ourselves in a situation where we have no supplies and nowhere to turn, nowhere to go to, and the hospitals and doctors are, for whatever reason, not an option for us, there are plants around us that will fit the bill in order for us to care for people we love at home. So friends, I hope you've enjoyed the video today. We did cover, of course, the 5 main diseases: cholera, dysentery and or diarrhea, typhoid, measles, and tuberculosis as part of this video. If you enjoyed the video and you'd like to learn more, consider training with me online. I have a 7-hour course, the Herbal Preparedness course, that's available there. You'll really enjoy it, I'm sure, if you've liked this video, because not only do we take these herbs and go forward into what they're useful for, but we also demonstrate and show different methods of preparing them. If you'd like to build up your supply storage, not only just of the bulk herbs, but also of prepared capsules and formulas to meet those needs, we also have those available on the website, thepatriotnurse.com, to get you started there as well. Friends, I'm a big believer that the best predictor of the future is the past, and I do not want to get caught unprepared in a time when I would be needed by people who really depend on me. And that's really, I think, where most of us are in the preparedness world. We don't do this because we want to sit there and gleefully crow over people who didn't prepare. We want to be a source of blessing and of really fulfilling duty and honor for those in our sphere of influence and whom God has trusted us with. So, friends, I know that if you are interested in this, there's a reason for it. And really, if you have a proclivity, if you have a fascination with this, and if you have an inclination and interest into learning these things, I'd run with it, because we were born for such a time as this. I do believe that God has put people sovereignly in my path, not only in watching this video, but also my students whom I've had the benefit, blessing, and pleasure to train. He's done this for a reason, and I do believe it's so that we can make the world a better place in dark times, that we can be that city on a hill and that light in the darkness, really to be a blessing for people and really be the hands and feet of the Lord and minister to them. So it is an aspect of faith, in my opinion, to operate in a place of support and love and blessing for people's health. And it's a call. So mad props for you if you finish watching this video. And if you did enjoy this video, I hope you'll share it with one person who you think might similarly be blessed and be interested in it. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. May the Lord bless and keep you all. For now, it's Patriot Nurse signing off, and I'll see y'all later.